Welcome to Tossing Grenade the Windmills. Windmills.
Precyber by T.C. Ricks and Ken Leitner. Chapter 45. Mike loved this part of the job. He sat in an exotic local bar, sipping the local cocoa-laced drink. The girls dressed in traditional local garb instead of the flimsy club outfits the girls back home wore. Back home, places like this were pretty rare. This bar had another thing most state-sized bars lacked. It attracted the kind of people Mike needed. Talented, violent people who would hurt others for money. You could find any two-bit thug for a nickel back home, but the wars here had bred a natural talent for war. Colombia had become the home of a warrior culture. Most mercenaries simply did not have the edge that growing up here gave the natives. He could hire the same in an air-conditioned bar stateside, but none with the experience of a Colombian or the willingness to tackle near-suicidal missions. Many years ago, this bar had hosted FARC revolutionaries or paramilitaries who simply fought for their feudal lords. Both fought for their ideology at first. That had ended soon enough. When their ideology failed them, they turned to kidnapping and smuggling. More recently, these lifetime warriors came here just to survive. This rural region suffered from extreme levels of poverty, something Mike could have predicted from the start. War might have made Mike wealthy, but the common man always suffered in its wake. No, finding someone willing to set off a bomb in New York would be easy down here. Most still blame the United States for their situation. While they had spent years spraying herbicides on their main cash crop, the United States government gave that up years ago. The poverty here had a more basic source. Nearly a half-century of blowing up the local infrastructure instead of building one. A lot of the revolutionaries said the same thing about Aqua Noir, but that was bullshit. The company had made the America that mattered more prosperous than it had ever been. He looked around the place and started to evaluate his potential candidates. He needed someone fairly stupid, but not stupid enough to get caught too early. Mike decided to err on the stupid side, though. He could always babysit the patsy until the event. Hell, he probably would anyway. This mission was too important. In one corner, he spied a few mean-looking men with certain bulges that told Mike they carried more than pistols. They seemed to have a little money. They wore new clothes and had some fat cigars in their mouths. Mike would have liked to work with that group. They looked like true professionals. However, they were entirely wrong for this job. The next few tables contained local farmers or field laborers. They kept their heads low and avoided looking at anyone but themselves. He could maybe use a farmer. If they needed the money enough, they might agree. However, Mike wanted someone with at least a little military background. A farmer might even have a moral crisis right before setting off the bomb. No, a farmer wouldn't do. Mike did not see anyone else who looked eligible for this kind of work. However, Mike had plenty of time. He could come back tomorrow and see who else showed. He could come back the next night, if he had to, or even the next night or the next. In fact, Mike decided he would probably prefer to take his time on this one. Instead, he found himself one of the local senoritas and retired to a local hotel for the night. Clarke spent the next day tearing through the data he had recovered from Lyson's office. They had found the best stuff on the first day, but had been no closer to catching Lyson, any of his minions, or even his boss. They decided to start looking at Lyson's other connections. One particular name showed up more frequently and more recently than any of the others. Lyson listed him as Mike Smith, though Clarke guessed that name was likely fictitious. Lyson did not pay Mike directly, but often arranged supplies for him and made travel arrangements as well. Clarke and Horst decided that they might track him down based on the travel information that they had at hand, and so they took the idea to Gabriel. Lyson's files show him traveling to Bogota, Colombia, just yesterday. My thoughts were to fly down there and watch these airports on the return flight. Gabriel looked up thoughtfully for a moment. Clarke had at first assumed Gabriel was using some weird management technique on him to get more information, but then he realized Gabriel was actually thinking. Gabriel said, I think I might know some people who could help. I'm Not so sure about you working with them, though. They aren't ideological types. In fact, they're kind of scary. But they are reliable. On the other hand, Clarke, you and Horace will need these men, because I don't think I can get you on a commercial flight. The Corp databases have you flagged as a fugitive and a murderer. Oh, yeah, right, replied Clarke. Yeah, right. You'll have to travel by less less conventional means. 5 days later, Mike had found his man. After 3 days of nothing, he finally decided to ask his nighttime companion. It turned out that she had a poor admirer who annoyed her every Friday night. Friday being 2 days away at the time, Mike took her into town the next day and bought her some new clothes. He had hoped to get her admirer all worked up, but she ended up buying a couple of strange green and neon jumpsuits, one for her best friend and one for herself. Anyway, the day in town was relaxing, and Thursday night's bedroom activities were more energetic than ever because her best friend joined them. Friday, he found the fawning lover. His Patsy turned out to owe a substantial debt to the bar, which only made Mike's job easier. He bought the man a beer and made a deal. The Patsy was far too desperate to turn anything down. Mike heard his whole life story in the process. The guy had joined FARC back in the kidnapping days with visions of a communist utopia. The moral bankruptcy of the organization had led him to drink, and now he took work wherever he found it, but secretly dreamed of blowing up the White House. Most of the world dreamed about that at this point. Now came the hard part. Mike had to get this sloshed Patsy into the USA. One could get drugs in easy enough, but the corps monitored the flight manifest closely. The extremist Muslims had ruined flying for all honest smugglers. The corps worried too much about their planes to let anyone doubtful on board anymore. No, Mike would probably have to take a ship. Ship captains like to hire on guns as protection against pirates. Mike reasoned if he could get this guy cleaned up, he could hire them both of them on and get back home and even make an extra little dough while doing it. The first step was getting back to Bogota. Clarke discovered he hated the jungle. It was hot, it was sticky and full of bugs. He had thought of the humid Atlantic climate would prepare him for South America. Oh, how wrong he had been. He sat in a dingy bar in the middle of nowhere. Some might call the place exotic. Clarke called it disgusting. The single wall was sticky, and the floor had bits of something he really didn't want to know about lingering from the night before. Clarke walked over and ordered a beer. He had met Che and Fidel back in Atlanta in what he had thought was a dingy bar. The Atlanta dingy bar had caused crisps all over the floor, and its South American counterpart had what looked like petrified vomit. However, that bar in Atlanta had air conditioning and lacked flies. More importantly, the posters of half-naked women posing on top of cars vastly improved the class of the place. The Venezuelan bar had one or two indigenous females hanging about. Clarke noticed that their lack of half-nakedness at first. The Colombian bar had one or two indigenous females hanging about. Clarke noted their lack of half-nakedness at first. How could they wear so much clothing? It was not native garb, that was for sure. Maybe some kind of bizarre cult? They wore green jumpsuits with black imported trim and thin skeins of micro-neon interwoven. Even in the middle of the jungle, they had more fashion sense than back home. On the other hand, just as the outfits started to grow on Clarke, he noticed the extreme lack of dentistry in their smiles. Still, the last few days he had been in a fugue state, which explained why Clarke kept confusing the two bars. Che had offered to take him down to South America, but Clarke had this funny thing about trusting people that had tried to kill him. However, Gabriel insisted that a friend of a friend had used them before, and so here he was, after a long ride on one of their smuggling runs. Fidel admitted casually, "We actually inherited our cousin's business. We just helped him out a few times." Che hit him on the back of the head. "Why are you telling him that? Do they really need to know that?" Fidel hit Che on the back of the head. "Don't do that again. Honestly, it is important in negotiations." "Are you insane?" Unbelievably, Che looked at Clarke for sympathy, as if Clarke would somehow understand what was happening. Clarke looked at Horace for sympathy in turn. Horace just looked amused. Clarke couldn't blame him. They had traveled simply enough. Clarke had assumed that they would take a boat or maybe one of those infamous Colombian mini-subs. Colombians manufactured the world's best mini-subs. Everyone knew the big smugglers used them to travel between Europe and China. Of course, nobody worried about smuggling anything to the U.S. anymore. No one particularly cared, but then again, most people did not worry about going there in the first place. You either belonged to the SIBA and avoided drug use out of fear, or you had no money for drugs anyway. Sure, people like Laban could make a good living selling weed, but the best smugglers had moved on to selling in China a long time ago. No, Fidel and Che's family business consisted of a standardized cargo crate. They had outfitted the interior surprisingly comfortably and aligned it with 7 different scanner-resistant materials, according to Fidel. Plus, even if some port agent opened up the first half, they would have to work their way through the secret back compartment. It worked against dogs, pigs, and a widely used commercially genetically engineered scanners. Unlike a mini-sub, it cost next to nothing to operate, so you could still make a little money off the depressed American market. It was also incredibly slow. It had taken them over 7 days on the slow boat. The 4 of them lived in a cramped, tight quarters the entire trip. On the 3rd day, Fidel and Che crept out of their to get their toilet water emptied and get fresh water. They had bribed one of the people on the ship to bring things, nice and comfy. While the crate could go another 7 weeks, Clarke could not even imagine being on board for that long. The water would have been constantly recycled, and it would have gotten unpleasant inside otherwise. Clarke didn't want to know. "Thanks for your help," Clarke said, and tried to be friendly. He didn't feel it. He had slowly realized that the 2 of them were not just mindless thugs, but complex and moderately interesting human beings who had, unfortunately, little or no empathy toward their fellow man. Che nodded, smiling a bit even. "Hey, no problem. You guys find what you're looking for?" Horse said, "Horse hopes that you find your own ass." Che and Fidel laughed. It had been a running joke among the 3 of them in the box that Clarke still didn't get. He didn't respond, since he was pretty damn sure the joke was at his expense. Che nodded. "Yeah, same to you." Clarke said, "You guys have some kind of contact number, in case we need to use your services again?" "You mean like the number you used to contact us in the first place?" Clarke stammered. Fidel snickered. "He's joking. That's the number we give our new clients. We change it around a lot. Yeah, we can give you our regular contact number." Clarke smiled and shook his head. "Thanks." He took the card and sipped a warm beer. He tried to close his mind instead of watching Che flirt with the toothless local girl in the strange green clothing. As such, he almost did not notice Fidel walk over. "Sorry, Yankee. I think we missed your man. Gloria tells me that there was an American mercenary in here all last week, but he left yesterday."
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson. Copyright 2012.
Kenneth Leitner
And Red Anvil Amalgamated.
To fight the forces of evil!